Industries Committee meeting to order. Got two bills on our agenda today. We had SB 420, which we heard your presentation, Senator Huffstetler, last time, and a little bit of the testimony, but I had quite a few other people that had signed up to testify. I wanted to give that a thorough hearing. And also Senate Bill 421, your Georgia Utility Rate Reduction Act. At the author's request, we're going to hear 421 first, since you didn't have an opportunity and you have some speakers lined up or people that want to be heard on that today. Podium would be ideal so you can be on camera and that we can all hear you from the mic.
Okay.
There is a committee substitute in the file, and that's what we're going to be working off of today. Make sure I got the right LC number. Okay, this is going to be LC 365154S. So all committee members, make sure you're working off the right copy. All right, Senator, the floor is yours. If you'd please try to explain to us what you're trying to accomplish here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I guess first, let me say what I'm not trying to talk about, and that's whether any cost overruns are justified or unjustified or lining in facilities or anything like that. This is not getting into who does what. This is simply saying whatever the cost is, here's a mechanism that's used in 22 other states that could help out in financing and that could be used to lower cost. One of those recently that used this was North Carolina, Duke Energy there. And we've seen estimates that said over a 10-year period, $1 billion of this could save 125 million in interest. The way this bill is written, you know, they can't do this unless the legislature authorizes them to do it. The way this bill is written, and I would point out in, I believe it's section 11, that they can't refuse, the Public Service Commission couldn't refuse them the regular way they're financing if they said, we don't want to use this. It's totally at the utility's discretion whether they use this financing or not. The legislature wouldn't require them to. The Public Service Commission under my bill would not require them to. It's just simply another tool that they can use. And I know attorneys here in Atlanta have worked on this in some of these other states, such as Florida and North Carolina. So I don't think this should be a real new issue, but I can get in the weeds a little bit with the bill, depending on who wants to, or I may phone a friend here for some of the really technical questions. But Moody's has said, as I've talked about in a handout I gave you, that securitization is credit positive for utilities because it provides an immediate source of cash while lowering customer rates. And as I mentioned before, it's not a new concept. 22 states use it, but we do have to authorize them to be able to use this. And it could certainly save hundreds of millions of dollars potentially over a period of time. It is no cost to the state. It doesn't need a fiscal note. You know, the review from other states have not shown constitutional issues. So that's the big picture of this, is we're trying to give a tool used in other states to save money on projects that could be used, but doesn't have to be used. And with that, I'll stop right there and take questions, I guess.
All right, so the word securitization is used quite a few times in here. Is that simply the issuance of bonds? Right,
it's the issuance of a security note on these that would be used to handle this debt. It doesn't go on there against them as a charge against their assets, but in reality, it is certainly a cost. But because the security people consider these a little bit more safe, it typically gets a little bit better interest rate on them.
So what are they secured by? Walk us through that. What's the security for these bonds?
Well, it would be the assets that would secure it. And, you know, we would have to sign off from the state and from the Public Service Commission that that we're approving of them doing this bond in this manner.
And is that the role you're asking the Public Service Commission to play in this? They have to approve, or issue these GURA bonds?
Right. They would have to sign off on it and say, we approve of you using these, but they couldn't, as the bill says, they couldn't require them to use them. And they couldn't say, because you're not using this, we're going to take away the other financing methods that you currently have. It's a permissive situation, but yet they have to review the financial, and say that this is valid, what you're trying to do with these bonds.
And how many other states currently allow this financing?
22
device?
states. And
Okay.
as I mentioned, Duke recently did this up in North Carolina with some attorneys from here actually helping out on that.
Other committee members have questions of Chairman Huffstetler. Senator Harbison.
For clarity, did I understand you say, Senator, that they can use it, but if they didn't, they can, I didn't quite hear.
Okay, this would be at the utility's discretion. We can't require them to use it.
But if they don't,
The Public Service Commission under this bill that I've written cannot require them to use it. But if we don't do this bill, they can't do it because it requires the state to act first to give them permission to do it. And that's what we're trying to do is say, we're going to give you permission to use this financing method. After that, it's totally up to you whether you use it or not, decide it's in your best interest. But as part of the process, you've got to have a public hearing. You've got to, go through the numbers, and the Public Service Commission would have to sign off and say, we think this is appropriate to be used. So their role would not be telling them to do it or not to do it, but as a safeguard in that what they're doing with the money is appropriate.
Other questions? All right, to recognize Secretary Senator Kennedy, number 6.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Huffstetler, for bringing this. And can you just explain in very simple general terms, what is the difference in securitization, as you've alluded to, and how it would work if this bill were passed and the utility elected to use this as a way of, as a financing vehicle? How is that different from just ordinary long-term debt that the utility would acquire and structure as part of their overall financial picture? What's the difference in the two?
Well, currently it would be what I believe in studies have shown is a higher cost of just capital financing. This is issuing bonds. And by doing this, they typically have a slightly lower rate. I've seen up to 100 basis points in some of them I looked at.
Is there something about the other statutes that are applicable that preclude the utility from absorbing debt that could be securitized as contemplated by this legislation and just rolling it into and structuring it with the other long-term debt vehicles that the utility has available to it? In other words, why couldn't they issue bonds anyway to accommodate whatever it is they're trying to absorb through this securitization method? And if it's bonds to bonds, are we talking about two different kinds of bonds, or do they go to the same market and would enjoy the same rates?
My understanding is that the state of Georgia has never authorized this type of bond to be used as other states have. And it seems, a lot of times when I do things, I look at other states, whether it's surprise billing or marketplace facilitator or anything, look at something that actually works in another state. And this seems to work in other states. So we're trying to set up an approval under Georgia laws where they could use this. But we also are trying to set up some safeguards in there that they have to have, as I said, public hearings. The PSC has to review it and see if they feel good with what they're doing. But it's just another tool that they could use, or they could completely not use, to say maybe there's some potential savings here.
One more question, Mr. Chairman. Last question, Senator. So is there anything about the language of the bill that would impair in any way the decision to securitize or not being 100% and totally that of the utility?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, you're the attorney and I'm not, but everything I've studied and the attorneys I've talked to, that there's nothing in here that would keep them from doing it. But again, it gives them permission, but doesn't require it.
And the election of the utility to securitize and go that route, that decision is 100% up to the utility.
100%
Others don't
utility.
participate even to a small degree in making that decision.
It clearly says that it's totally at their discretion. However, they can't just say they're going to do it. They have to go through the process and have the PSC say that now that you've said you want to do this, we want to make sure that this is appropriate to because it does give them an infusion of cash. And so they want to make sure that it's appropriate what they're doing and would have to sign off and say, we agree with this, but it doesn't make them do it. It's totally at their discretion, but somebody's got to look at that and say, you know, do we think for the state of Georgia that this is a good use of money?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, so while you're on that, you need to explain this infusion of cash. Your bill limits the purposes that these type of bonds can be issued on page,
Mhm.
looks like page 5, starting at line 13. Walk that through us so we can understand what's the reason for this or the purpose of these, the uses of the cash raised through the sale of these bonds.
Well, when I was saying that, I was talking about particularly on Duke because they had some, I think in their case, it was some stormwater cleanup costs of about $1 billion rather than and maybe infusion is wrong, but rather than using the assets they had on hand and maybe perhaps getting their cash low, they're able to do these security bonds and finance it. And versus if they went on the market, you know, and just did some capital financing, it was saving them some interest rates. So if they're swapping them, it could, you know, if they're swapping them for something, it could be an infusion of cash, but it's probably more a prevention of cash being drained by, you know, for particularly in the case of unexpected costs.
All right, well, where I'm looking at on line 114 is these are allowed for a new nuclear unit put into service after July 1st, 2022.
Mhm.
Line 115 for a retired electrical generating unit with remaining book value that necessitates the continued collection of revenue from the customers. Or on line 117, capital construction associated with cleanup or remediation of any coal combustion residuals. I'm guessing that's coal ash
Mhm.
situation. So as I'm reading your legislation, those are the only 3 purposes you could utilize this securitization method or this issuance of bonds. Am I right about that?
I think that's correct. And I wasn't saying that we could do that. I was just giving an example of what Duke had done in North Carolina.
And their
with some
problems
costs.
with the coal ash where they were about to go bankrupt, having to pay to clean up these coal ash ponds.
They had some unexpected costs, I think, that came upon them. Yeah.
Right, so the name of your bill is the Georgia Utility Rate Reduction Act. Explain to us how this would reduce utilities customers' power bills. That's
Well,
the
if
goal
you,
of it, right?
if you can save 150 million in interest costs or anything like that, then the potential is there for lower utility rates. And I know when the Public Service Commission presented in our meeting for budget for this last week, they talked about that being, you know, one of their big goals. They've got to look at any and all ways that we can save money and thereby reduce utility costs and thereby lower rates for customers.
Does this in any way shift the burden from the rate payers, the utilities customers, to the shareholders?
Not to my knowledge, but
Okay. All right. Well, we have several people lined up to speak. Thank you for, yeah, absolutely. Senator Gooch. You don't need one.
Thank you, Chairman Huffstetter. This bill, I read it over the weekend and still trying to get my arms around it, but can you go through the changes in the sub that we just saw?
well, I probably would need somebody else to do that because they were mainly just some minor cleanup languages, but I think probably Liz Cole, she had made some suggestions and our legislative council worked on those together.
If I read correctly in the bill, maybe some other information I looked at over the weekend, the savings from this refinancing get spun off and put on other projects like carbon reduction projects and other things of that nature? Or is that, am I reading from? other-
I don't have any knowledge of that. I'm pretty sure that's not the case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Roy Bowen, President of the Georgia Association of Manufacturers. The association has been involved with the PSC and General Assembly really for decades to ensure that Georgia consumers of electric energy from regulated utilities are served with competitively priced and reliably delivered electricity. And in fact, I will tell you that's one of the reasons that Georgia is #1 for business investment, because the General Assembly and the PSC have worked to ensure that. The concept of securitization to lower costs for consumers of Georgia Power was first proposed by this association during the, as we were an intervenor in the 2019 Georgia Power rate case. But to do so, as Senator Huffstetler suggested, does require authorization by legislation from the General Assembly. And I do want to thank Senator Huffstetler and Senators Albers and Tippins have both co-signed this bill. I'd like to introduce Clay Jones, who's our Vice President and General Counsel, and has worked with me at the commission and here for some 15 years on utility matters. And he really does the heavy lifting for us over at the PSC. We're heavily involved in this. We understand the issue. Be happy to answer any questions, but the association does support this legislation as a means of reducing potential costs for all classes of customers.
Thank you, Roy, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Appreciate being before you today. As Roy said, my name is Clay Jones. I'm the Vice President and General Counsel for GAM. And I wanted to, first of all, start by thanking again Chairman Huffstetler and the other sponsors of this bill for bringing it forward today. As Roy alluded to, securitization financing is something we proposed and suggested as a potential lower cost option for ratepayers during the 2019 Georgia Power rate case. And at that time, the idea was to use it as a method for recovering costs related to Georgia Power's coal ash cleanup program, which actually, if you look at the costs of that, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it's not dissimilar to another nuclear plant. I mean, over several decades, the cost for that cleanup is going to be quite significant. But we determined, as Roy mentioned, that state law did not authorize utilities to finance costs in that manner. And so that's what this bill is designed to do, to change that by giving an option to the company and to the commission to consider. And as was mentioned before, it's used in over 20 jurisdictions, including North Carolina. Also in Florida, they have this option. Going back to Chairman Calcert's point about what the bill would address, it would allow the utility to seek the issuance of bonds to recover costs related to nuclear construction, coal ash cleanup, and retirement of generating units with remaining book value. These are not theoretical costs. All three of those categories are facing ratepayers in the coming years. As you know, with Plant Vogtle units 3 and 4 coming online eventually. Also, we have state and federal environmental regulations that have compelled Georgia Power to remediate its coal ash ponds. That was what we were talking about in the 2019 case. And just recently, last month, they filed, or earlier this month, they filed their 2019 or 2022 integrated resource plan. And this is where they look at what kind of generation and transmission and distribution needs they're going to need going out over the next couple of decades. And as part of that filing, they're proposing to retire a number of coal-fired generation units over the next several years. And based on the analysis we've looked at, the remaining book value of those by the time they're retired collectively would be over $2 billion. So again, these are not the costs that this bill is meant to address and give an option for are not theoretical costs. They're real costs that are being faced by ratepayers. So we support the bill, and we do have some suggested improvements to the bill, or things that could add to the bill. And I just want to briefly talk about those. One, we think that we want to establish the principle that these bonds are only to be used for purposes of reducing these recoverable regulatory assets, which is a fancy utility word for saying, these costs that are being caused by these three categories. We also would like to ensure that the bonds achieve savings. So it was asked before, could the company simply decide to do this? They still have to seek approval from the commission. They have to bring forward the plan. The commission would have a hearing. All the interveners that would be interested in it would be involved, and they would issue an order. But as part of that process, we want to make sure that these proposed bonds do achieve the savings and benefits for customers that they are alleged to do. Also, that they don't recover costs that are already being recovered in some other way, or double dipping, so to speak. You have to be very careful with utility rates. They get very complex, and you want to make sure that costs are recovered by only one vehicle. We want to look for the lowest possible bond charges we can get consistent with market conditions, and limit the securitized amount to the amount that's needed to pay for these costs. We also would like to see the bill require the utility to pursue available mitigation measures. And what do I mean by that? Well, before you start securitizing these costs, you want to make sure the costs are as low as possible to begin with. And just to give you an example, coal ash, when you clean up a coal ash pond, there are some secondary market uses for coal ash and I know, to Georgia Power's credit, they have tried to do this to sell into those secondary markets, make some money back before they spend all the money there to clean it up if somebody has a use for it. And there could be other ways to do that, but to really require the utility to look at potential mitigation measures. And then the last one that's gets a little technical and esoteric for rate making, and so I'll try not to put you to sleep, but rates are designed in a certain way to recover certain costs from certain classes or the other. And we think the bill ought to just say that if you issue these bonds for a particular cost, let's say a coal plant you're retiring, that it ought to be recovered in the same manner that the commission has determined in its most recent case to recover the cost of that asset, so that the recovery and rate design follows the asset itself. So those were the comments. I want to thank Chairman Huffstetler again and the other sponsors of this bill. Look forward to working with the committee and moving forward to pass a bill that can give Georgia Power an option to provide some relief to customers, because all customers, whether it's business customers or individual customers, residentials, we're facing quite a bit of significant utility costs on these cost categories, and we would like to give the company as many tools as it can to mitigate those costs. And that's all the comments I had this morning or this afternoon. I'll be glad to answer questions if I can.
We've got a few committee members with questions.
Okay.
I got a couple, and these are pretty elementary, and you'll have to forgive my ignorance on this area, but is say the Southern Company or Georgia Power able to issue a bond of some sort now without PSC approval?
I think those questions are going to, let me try to, and I'm not a bond lawyer, so I got to be careful here, but they go out and acquire financing to finance their costs right now. The difference with this bill is it would, I think, create what they call a special purpose entity to issue these bonds that could be recovered at a lower rate. And if they go out and just traditionally finance their costs, those are put into what's called rate base, which then translates into the rates that we all pay. And that includes a return on equity, as well as a tax impact. So I think that's how these special issued bonds that require this authorization can achieve a lower cost. But again, we would want to make sure the bill, I think it does in some ways, but we want to really make sure that the bill would have the commission approve this only if it could be shown that it would in fact create those lower costs.
Do you know how the Plant Vogel's being financed now? I mean, where's the money, these billions and billions coming from,
right,
to build that plant?
So right now, the plant is still not operational. Traditionally, just don't want to give you the whole history of the world, but traditionally, costs associated with a utility plant or regeneration plant are recovered once the plant's turned on and providing service. But this legislature, this General Assembly, passed a bill that allowed the financing costs, which they're using traditional financing methods to do, to be recovered in advance on consumer bills. So if you have your Georgia Power bill and it says nuclear cost construction recovery rider on it, that's what that is. And so the idea was to recover those financing costs in advance of completion of the plant, so that when the plant came online, some of the costs would be paid for and it wouldn't be as big a rate impact at the time.
And that was basically just the interest that they were paying on the money they were borrowing to go build these nuclear.
That is
reactors.
correct. They are not recovering any of the capital cost. They have not yet recovered any of the
Do
capital
you know
costs. and
where
they
that's
won't.
coming from? Do they just have a huge bank account with 20 billion in it, or they go borrow the money? Did they sell stock to get it? Did they issue bonds? I'm curious.
Yeah, I
And
don't,
there's a coalition of people. I'm not just picking on Georgia Power.
no,
but
I understand. Yes.
This bill applies only to them, right?
Several owners, right, with Oglethorpe, City of Dalton, there are others that are involved with it. It's a variety of instruments, I think. I think Georgia Power would have to be the one to really answer all of that in terms of the details of it.
Right. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jones, some of my questions are similar to what the chairman just asked, but bear with me that
that's
I may
okay.
be oversimplifying.
Bear
this,
with
but
my answers.
I'm trying to, yes, sir. I will bear with each other. So if, for the topics we're talking about, if Georgia Power, for example, does not use securitization to service those debts, then how would they manage the debt? How would it otherwise be accommodated?
Yeah, so they get approval to pursue certain projects, build certain things, and then they have to go finance them. So they go out in the market just like everybody else does and tries just that's traditional financing. But that all goes into rates, which when you have a rate case, you look at all their costs, you look at the costs they're going to have, their projected revenues, and then you design rates, but those have to be recovered by ratepayers and include a return on equity as well as a tax impact, which I don't believe the reason these bonds can be cheaper is that they would not require that.
They would not require what?
There wouldn't be a rate of return on them, is my understanding. They would be recovered, it would just be a special purpose entity would issue the bonds and they can achieve a lower cost that way. Some of
Okay.
the studies like Chairman Hofstadter was referring to saving, hundreds of millions of dollars.
So is the concept behind the securitized bonds is that they are not secured with company assets, with Georgia Power assets?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question. I'll just be honest. I mean,
And it would seem that the importance of knowing the answer to that question
Right.
seemingly, and again, I'm
Sure.
oversimplifying this, I'm sure, but if in fact securitized bonds are secured by Georgia Power's assets.
Right.
And there are different kinds of credit facilities, but just taking securitized bonds versus other long-term credit facilities that Georgia Power utilizes through bonds,
Right.
presumably those are secured by the assets of Georgia Power as well, right?
right.
So either kind of bond that might be used, securitized or other, rely upon the equity of the assets of Georgia Power to secure them,
Okay.
right?
I think so.
Okay, so if that's the case, what does this shift of adding more debt to the equity or the assets of Georgia Power do? Stated another way, I can see, and I'm sure Chairman Hofstetler's right with regard to maybe getting securitized bonds at a better rate. But if you're shifting additional debt onto the assets of Georgia Power via securitized bonds, at some point, the numbers start to shift, and it would seem that the non-securitized bond rates start to go up because the debt to equity ratios have now shifted. And I'm just wondering, is there, at some point, it would seem there's a tipping point where it's a wash and potentially could be worse for ratepayers and the equity holders of Georgia Power if this inadvertently drives up the bond or borrowing cost or credit facility cost on the non-securitized type debt.
I think the way I would answer that question is that in the other states, again, 22 other states that have utilized this, we've seen it be positive for, again, the utilities credit rating, which again keeps costs down. And again, the commission, this wouldn't simply be a choice of Georgia Power to just do this without authorization. The commission and other parties hire experts to bring into all these cases that look at the costs. And so if there were, those inadvertent possible costs, or then that's something that could come out in the testimony with the expertise of the commission and its staff to make sure. And that, again,
But
going back to
excuse
our
me, but wouldn't
amendments.
those answers partly to hinge on things that no one could predict?
Well,
And that is, and even me, I admit in my question, I'm speculating on what the management of the company would decide about future credit facilities about things that we don't know yet.
Well, Roy mentioned that I've been practicing down in the commission for 15 years with him, but before that I was practicing 10 more. So I've been down there actually 25 years.
Yeah.
And I can tell you that there are a lot of assumptions that are made in these cases that sometimes don't turn out to be true. And that's a fair point. And, you know, I mean, you just look at, you know, the situation with Plant Vogel, we all thought it would be finished by now. And then there's been a lot of, you know, issues that have come up, but you know, it's moving along. There's a certain amount of uncertainty that is involved in all of these cases. So yeah, you're right. It could end up with different effects, but I think that there's enough expertise over there to look at what it gives us the best chance to lower these costs. And again, we wouldn't be for this bill if we thought it was going to raise rates for ratepayers for sure.
Sure, and I get that. I
Yeah, yeah.
completely believe that, and thank you. And Mr. Chairman, just I guess one comment and then one last question. It seems to me when we're talking about nuclear power construction, CCRs, retirement of large, we're talking about securitizing really large debt items, if you will. These are not a fleet of 100 trucks or something.
No, they're
And
very
so-
significant.
Very significant. So it, in my mind, seemingly could have an impact. Last question, Mr. Jones, and thank you for being here, is
Yes, sir.
in the previous discussions, whether it's been at the PSC or in some other forum, when I assume this, it sounds like this idea has been bannered around.
Mhm.
What reasons did Georgia Power give, if any, as to why they would not like to see some legislation like this passed?
Well, I'll be careful not to speak for the company, but I'll just go on my own recollection, which is that we raised the issue and there was no opposition to the issue. I won't tell you that Georgia Power is for it, but I haven't heard that they're against it either. Would be interested to know if they are. But I think the issue then was, well, we can't, I mean, it became a moot issue because we couldn't do it because it wasn't authorized by state law. So basically our testimony in that case ended up being, well, let's look at it, you know, because we can't legally implement it right now.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate it.
Other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Other speakers, y'all can help me with this too. When I first read the bill, I had the traditional opinion that if you're securitizing something, you're pledging some property against that debt. And I'm thinking, okay, we're going to pledge these nuclear power plants to guarantee the payment that, you know, if you default, they foreclose on the plant or the coal. Then it didn't make sense because these coal powered plants that are being shut down are not exactly desirable assets to have as your security for your debt. As I read the bill, and some of y'all help me when you speak, at line 120 on page 6, the GURA property that is securitizing or being pledged for the repayment of these bonds are payments coming in from customers. If I'm reading it right,
That's correct.
It's the interest in the power generator to collect from their customers anyway. And that as approved by PSC would be applied to these bonds.
That's exactly right, Mr. Chairman.
But that the ratepayers would benefit because that interest rate would be lower
That's right.
on these.
That's right.
Our, you know, rates that we pay include amounts to recover financing charges, and that's part of
That's
the rate process that we've talked about. And that amount would be lesser if they were under these type of bonds. Am I
That's exactly
close
right,
to
Mr.
being
Chairman.
onto this?
Yes, that's
Okay.
exactly right.
All right. Well, this is Ms. Liz Coyle from Georgia Watch. Introduce yourself and share your thoughts on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee and Chairman Huffstetler for the opportunity to speak strongly in support of this legislation today, the Georgia Utility Rate Reduction Act. I am Liz Coyle. I'm the executive director of Georgia Watch. We're a statewide consumer advocacy organization. And I'm here to speak in support of this legislation because fundamentally, we believe no company should earn extra profit on a project that experiences extreme schedule delays and massive cost overruns. Now, Chairman Huffstetler correctly pointed out that this bill in no way makes any determination about what costs will ultimately be borne by Georgia Power's customers once Vogel units 3 and 4 are complete. But I think it's really important to point out that and before you now and earlier with the Mr. Bowens and Mr. Jones with the Georgia Manufacturers Association, you have the two representatives of the largest customer classes in the state of Georgia. Georgia Watch and GMA don't always agree. We agree on this because fundamentally this legislation does just what Chairman Cowsert said. It allows, and I think that, yeah, I want to make sure you got the handouts out. Thanks, Andy. It allows the company to voluntarily identify certain capital costs that could be recovered through the issuance of these securitized bonds once the commission has approved a non-bypassable charge on customers' bills to guarantee the bond market that will be paid back. So rather currently there were some questions earlier about how the traditional financing mechanism works. And as Mr. Jones said, they'll do it. Some will be debt, some will be return on equity. Right now, they've got a nuclear construction cost recovery tariff that the average Georgian will have paid $900 on before the units start producing power. With that traditional approach, the company earns up to 12% profit on those expenditures, those capital expenditures, because that's what the commission has authorized them to earn. If you use securitized bonds to recover certain asset-related costs, you're looking at long-term cost of debt, 3%. So that's where the significant savings can come in. I want to make sure I want to get hold of myself. I'm going back and sort of answering things that came up already, but I do want to go have a chance to say a little bit more about why we think this is such a good bill. According to expert witnesses hired by the Georgia Public Service Commission, Georgia Power currently stands to earn an extra $5 billion in profit tied directly to delays and cost overruns in the construction of Plant Vogtle Units 3 and 4. That's because the commission has authorized the company to earn a 12% return on equity on their capital expenditures, regardless of whether they stay on time or budget. Essentially, it is profits on cost overruns that we think this bill can address. Not only that, but it is an opportunity for the company to voluntarily work with the commission to put downward pressure on rates. You heard from Mr. Jones, this is a year of an integrated resource plan and another rate case year. In the integrated resource plan, the company is announced their desire and asking commission approval to close all of their coal burning facilities early. And those early retired coal plants will have a remaining net book value, in some cases, a significant amount of money. And so again, this bill is an opportunity for the power company and the commission voluntarily to relieve some of the higher costs coming on customers' bills by issuing securitized bonds for the remaining net book value on coal plants that are no longer producing power. Again, we argue that the company absolutely has a right to recover the costs of constructing those plants. But once they're not producing power, we think it would be much fairer on their ratepayers to pay that 3% interest on bonds to recover those costs rather than earn a profit on generating units that aren't producing any power. And again, as discussed earlier, this could be used, the company has said, and it's again in the integrated resource plan, they're going to have to, they're mandated to clean up the coal ash ponds in the state. And this is another tool when we know that costs are going up, rates are going up, rate increases have already been approved for 2023. When units 3 and 4 go into service, the company predicts a 10% increase in rates. So we think that this is a benefit for the company to be able to show their commitment to their customers and in a way that they can, in a way that's favorable to Wall Street, they can take down some of that higher cost burden on their customers. We're not suggesting that this should be applied to all of the costs, certainly not to all of the costs associated with constructing Vogtle 3 and 4. But we do think it would be appropriate to ask the company if they would consider whether earning profits on cost overruns is in the best interest of their customers. And perhaps they could identify, once the commission has had a proceeding to determine what costs should be borne by the company's shareholders and what costs should be borne by ratepayers, whatever that amount is, that perhaps some of us would argue all of it should be absorbed by shareholders, but we think that there will probably be some costs that are in the cost overrun category, and we think those would be well applied with the securitized bond approach. Handout has been passed around. I think some of the questions you have had may be answered in the handout. I'm happy to pause and take some questions now, or I'm just happy to also walk you through the handout.
Just hold on for 1 second now. Make sure I got my brain around this. When the PSC is setting the rates for Georgia Power, they generally take into all the costs that are incurred by Georgia Power in providing this electricity to us. Everything from building the plants, maintaining the lines, sending the trucks out to, you know, get your power back on when it snows. And they guarantee some type of rate of return to reward them for having incurred that cost for our benefit.
That's correct.
And are you saying that interest incurred in building these facilities is a cost that they are allowed to recover and a profit on that cost as well?
That is correct. Mr. Jones mentioned the nuclear construction cost recovery tariff that's on customers' bills. I want to point out that Senator Huffstetler in 2018 carried a piece of legislation that sunset the Nuclear Financing Act. That was for the first time, and unless the commission, unless the legislature again gives us an authority, they'll go back to the traditional financing mechanism way that they do it. They build the infrastructure. Once the infrastructure is providing electricity, they put that into the rate base, and that's when they also recover the financing costs. But with Vogtle 3 and 4, first time ever in the state, they have been collecting the financing costs in advance. Since 2011, there has been a rider on customers' bills, and is the majority of what's been collected has been from residential customers who've been prepaying the financing costs for
And are
Vogtle
they-
3 and 4,
are
and they get a profit. So when you pay your right for the originally, had the units been on time and on budget, it was expected that the financing cost would be $1.6 billion. It's now approaching $4 billion because of the delays and cost overruns. So people are paying a lot more in the nuclear tariff than they were supposed to,
That's
and-
because the debt's been out there for a longer time.
because they've been collecting it for longer, and the delays have added up to that. So when the customer gets their bill and they've got, you know, whatever that dollar amount is on their bill, maybe, you know, maybe it's $10 on their bill that month, every month, for the nuclear construction financing cost tariff. Nearly half of that is the company's profit and income tax on profit.
All right. So the customers are getting charged the actual amount of the interest plus more to give Georgia Power a profit on it?
Correct.
Got it.
And with securitization, they would still recover the financing costs, but it would be at the long-term cost of debt 2.5% to 3%, not the currently commission approved 12%.
And there's the savings to the ratepayer.
And it's a savings to ratepayers.
Okay. Any other questions at this juncture? Else I'm gonna let her finish. All right.
Clarification.
Senator again.
Good. Thank you.
Tomato. Do that once in a while.
Thank you for being with us today. Did I hear you were talking about securitization of these coal power plants that still have a useful life in them? Are they already closed down, or you're projecting that they will close?
Well, the company has closed some plants already as authorized in the 2019 Integrated Resource Plan. They've just filed a 2022 Integrated Resource Plan that's before the commission now, and hearings will be happening on that request. But in the company's filing, the company is asking the commission to give them permission to close all remaining coal plants by 2035, and some very soon in the next few years. So that the coal plants, because they're uneconomic to operate. So the company is proposing other means of meeting the state's electric needs without using the coal plants. The coal plants still work. The coal plants could still be used. So our point is, if the coal plants have a remaining again, net book value on them, but they're no longer being used to serve the needs of the customers in the state. We think a better way for the company to recover the remaining value of those plants on customers' bills is through a securitized bond where the customers are not paying a profit on coal plants that aren't providing them any power.
So you would borrow hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars against an asset that is closed down or it's about to close down. It sounds like a
So
conservation easement to me. Is that too simple?
So this, and Mr. Jones touched on this, and it is complicated, but it's not like a bond that the company would traditionally issue in that way. These are specialized bonds that are actually issued by a third party for the, once there would be a procedure to identify what the remaining net book value of coal plant XYZ is. That amount, let's say it's $30 million, just off the top of my head. That $30 million, there would be a bond issued for that the commission would approve, and the commission would put a non-bypassable charge, pass-through charge on customers' bills for, let's say, 30 years. These bonds could be issued for 30 years. So over 30 years, customers would be paying back that specialty bond, again, at a lower cost, at 3% versus 12% interest, until that asset is paid for by the customers. It's not an additional debt for the utility. There's no burden on the state. It's just a different way of recovering, of the Georgia Power recovering the costs of that facility on customers' bills. And the key difference and why we support this is it reduces the long-term, the cost of the debt from 12% to 3%-ish.
So again, you're recognized for question.
Thank you for your comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Said one of the things I think I see Commissioner Shaw on the big screen up there, and we're going to have Stu at break here, Commissioner Shaw. But one of the things that I would ask would follow up Senator Gooch's question. Why would we want to be idling coal plants when we're going to electric vehicles and we need electricity in Georgia? And I don't know if that question is for Commissioner Shaw or Georgia Power or who, but to me,
I
that
can
doesn't
answer
sound
that
like it.
for you. The questions are for Liz Coyle. When these gentlemen testify, you'll have a chance to ask them questions. Senator Lucas.
Mr. Chairman, if I'm not mistaken, part of that cost was they had a contractor, and the feds came in and they had to tear everything up and start all over again. And it's what I used to call CWIP, construction work in progress, that ratepayers pay for the construction of if I'm not mistaken, the legislature took it upon ourselves to pull the Public Service Commission back on the last project, the Georgia Power, and went with the Georgia Power folks. But when you talk about coal-fired plants, conservationists have ridiculed and actually jumped on Georgia Power. I would assume that's the reason that Georgia Power bought Atlanta Gas Line, to make power and to shut those coal plants down because there's a great cost on a coal ash plant of removing the ash, which a lot of folks have had the problem with. So, this thing needs some studying because Georgia Power is a utility. It's the only utility that I know that's guaranteed profit. It's guaranteed profit by law. The recovery of costs per se, and when you talk about bonds, to me, they would go out and try to get the best rate they can get on paying the money back that they have borrowed for the construction cost. So the matter gets real complicated because you start talking about what it costs to produce a kilowatt. And the next thing you know, you got the citizens of the ratepayers who are looking at the cost. And when you talk about commercial, they get a different rate than regular ratepayers because of the consumption use that they use. So this thing's kind of all drawn out. I mean, you need 30 lawyers just dealing with this thing to try to make some sense of how the cost goes back to the customer versus what the return is on the guaranteed side. You know, it's just kind of hard to say. I mean, you got to get down to how much it costs to do a kilowatt and all that.
Senator, we're still in the questioning and testimony phase. We're not to discussion yet, but you're making some real good points and raising some good questions, but I don't think they're to this presenter. I've got a couple other questions. I'm gonna recognize you, Senator Brass, and then Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was looking at your chart on the back here. And so when we're talking about these bonds, we're talking about typically 30-year bonds or,
And we're proposing, and other states who've used this for early retired coal plants it's been about 30 years.
about
So
30.
you want to tie it to, wait, potentially so if it were applied to Vogtle units 3 and 4, the company has the expectation of recovering those costs and rate base over 60 years. So, and I'm also want to go back to in a minute and answer, somebody asked a question about what amendments were added to the subversion that's in front of you. And one of those does say that for nuclear units, we would suggest perhaps a longer life be considered, 60 years to be similar to what they would use, but 30 years would be typical for the kind of coal assets that we're talking about that other states have done.
Okay, well, so that brings me, I guess, to my question on your chart. I'm seeing that under traditional rate-based approach, that it looks like it starts out in year one somewhere around, I don't know, $95 million. And then by year 10 is down, drops about 10 million per year down to about 10 million in year 10. And under the securitization approach, it stays at 40 million year 1 through year 10. So when we're looking at, and I see in your analysis that in a 10-year total, securitization versus traditional rate-based approach would save about, what is that, 120 million or so?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what about over the life of the entire bond? Is securitization going to stay at that 40 million for years 11 through 30? And then, if the traditional rate-based approach continues on the same trend that your chart has it on, it looks to me like year 11, they'd be at somewhere close to zero. And so to me, it looks like in year 13, y'all are going to be at net neutral. And then year 14 and beyond, securitization looks like it's more expensive to me. Is that, help me work through that?
Thank you for that question. And I'm not a chart designer, but what I can tell you that this chart is intending to show is that the overall, there would be that, what we would say over the life of the recovery of the asset, there would be an overall savings of $125 million.
Through 10 years.
But what this chart is meant to show is specifically that the savings occur very quickly in the early years. And we want to draw home the fact that customers have been paying for Plant Vogtle 3 and 4, the financing costs, since 2011, more than 10 years. A lot of people paying that nuclear tariff maybe already have died or will die or moved out of the state. And people have been paying to get power from those units, and we still don't know when the units will be producing power. We do know that when the units go into service, the company has said that will put 10% upward pressure on rates. We think it's important to get the savings for customers earlier on in the process. That's what this chart is trying to show. I'm sorry if it's,
well, I
maybe
mean,
not.
for me, I'm 44. I plan on being here for the life of this bond. And for me personally, it seems like it'd be better, I've been paying on it for 10 years and I only got 3 more years and then I'm going to be trending back up. Based on your chart for a relatively young guy, I'm looking around the committee. I would say it's more beneficial for me to go. I would want the traditional rate-based approach based on your chart. Okay. Well, that's my question. I'm trying to understand, are we talking about 30-year bonds? Because we're talking about 30 and 60 year, but we're only looking at 10-year. So
Well, just
Second
to
up,
that
Senator
point,
Kennedy.
yeah. Thank you, Senator Brass. I think you're making a great point, and this is missed on me as well. I think if y'all have addressed this, I just missed it. The question is not really this chart. What is the amortization schedule? Is it 30 years or is it 10 years, regardless of what the bonds are? Because you can have a bonding period, just like you can have a promissory note for a shorter period of time than the amortization schedule. And I think that's what Senator Brass is asking.
And I understand that now. Thank you. So as we discussed earlier, in most states that have apply this to net book value, stranded assets from coal plants, they've been 30-year bonds. We've suggested that that's appropriate for early coal plant retirement, but we've in some of the language that's included in the substitute you have before you, we introduced a longer period, suggesting that perhaps in the case of a nuclear asset where the company intends to recover that cost over a 60-year period, that we would have the securitized bonds match whatever the company's plan was for the additional. And some of that, again, we're saying with Vogtle 3 and 4, not all of the Vogtle 3 and 4 costs, but those specifically that occurred as a result of cost overruns, that some portion of those could be recovered over 60 years, while the company is using the traditional rate base for whatever the commission has authorized in their prudency review that says that the commission is authorizing them to recover the capital costs and any remaining financing costs tied to those capital costs over the 60 to 80-year lives of the units. We would suggest that if the company voluntarily, with commission approval, thought that it was potentially looked good for them to say to their customers, we know that your bills are going up a lot now. And one of the reasons they're going up a lot are these 2 new nuclear units. We want to offer you some relief. And so we're voluntarily agreeing that some portion of our right to profit off cost overruns, we instead want to recover using securitized bonds. So we still recover the financing costs, but we'll only apply 3% interest rather than earning our profit on those cost overruns. We think that's actually a really good PR move for the company.
What has the PSC done to control cost on this? They have to approve these cost overruns if they're going to get built into rates, right?
That is
Do they
correct.
just approve any cost overrun, or
That is correct, Chairman Calzert. And the commissioners, again, I'm like Mr. Jones, I'm not going to speak for the company or the commissioners, but they will tell you, and we've heard this because Mr. Jones and I have been participating in these Vogtle hearings for many, many years. The company will have to go before the commission once units 3 and 4 are operating and in service 24/7. At that point, the commission will have what's called a prudency review. And they will determine, and it will be the company's burden to prove that the cost overruns were prudently incurred. The commission will then consider some of the staff's recommendations. And I can tell you that again, they hire expert witnesses who testify in these proceedings every 6 months. We're now entering into the 26th one, the 26th Vogtle construction monitoring. And the expert witnesses that have been hired have been making the case that many of these cost overruns were imprudently incurred. There will be a proceeding where the company experts, the commission staff experts, and interveners like Georgia Watch and Georgia Manufacturers Association will cross-examine witnesses and file briefs. And at the end of the day, the commission will determine what rates will go into the rate base. This process for securitized bonds would happen after that. If there are some amounts that the commission authorizes, but were clearly not part of the originally approved $4.4 billion. These were originally $4.4 billion was what the cost was supposed to be at certification.
Where are we at now?
10.6. That's just Georgia Power's portion, by the way. I was certainly here in Georgia. I was not showing up at the commission back in the 70s and 80s. I was growing up then, but Vogtle 1 and 2 were proposed to cost just under $1 billion and to be complete in a few years in the 70s. 12 years later, in the mid 80s, they were complete at $9 billion. The commission authorized the company to collect $8 billion of those $9 billion, and $1 billion was absorbed by their shareholders. That's why we think we need to anticipate now ways to protect ratepayers from what are proving to be massive cost overruns.
I'm gonna have to stop you here. I have Mr. Aaron Abramovitz, I think I'm pronouncing that right, from Georgia Power Company that wants to speak, and I think it's only fair to let them.
Absolutely.
tell
May I
their
just,
side.
I do have, there was a question earlier about what's in what are the changes that were proposed in the substitute you have before you. If you'd like, I could quickly answer that question, or I could come up after Mr. Abramovitz and
You go ahead and answer
Okay.
that one. And then we'll,
thank you. And
we'll
I'll,
go
then I'll
forward.
sit down and thank you for your time. There were a few proposals that have been incorporated in amendments in the draft you have before you. The first one was wanting to make clear that the scheduled maturity date would be determined by the commission, and addresses specifically that we originally said not 32 years, and then we realized that we ought to have 60 years when we're talking potentially about nuclear assets, because that's how long the company would be recovering under the traditional approach. So that was amendment number one. That's at that late line 91, I believe, in the new draft. And then we also have text at line, I think this is the old line 106 to 110. GURA cost means any of the pretext costs that an electric utility has incurred or will incur for eligible projects for which a financing order has been issued. Such term does not include any monetary penalty, fine, or forfeiture assessed against an electric utility by a government agency. What we've done there again is we wanted to have language that well, now I've lost what that one does. Oh, we added in specifically, we wanted to make clear, I've been talking a lot about the prudency review just now. And so in the revision you have before you in section 12, it makes very clear that we're not talking about applying this to any costs that have not already been deemed prudent by the commission and eligible to go into the customer's rates. We also wanted to make very clear when this was drafted, our intent was new nuclear applied to Vogtle 3 and 4. We wanted to have language in there that made it very clear by saying that we're talking about new units once they go into service, not while they're under construction. So that's what that does.
What line's that?
That one is at lines 13. I mean, on page 13, I'm sorry.
So that was a
Lines
change.
37 to 374 to 376.
Okay.
Oh, no, wait, I'm sorry. The new nuclear unit is lines 112, is line 112.
Okay.
And then there's another change that just was a really more of a grammatical error that got fixed in lines 374 to 376.
All right. Thank you. Sure, I could make a crack or a joke of some sort there, but we're gonna stay serious here. Your humor is always appreciated, Mr. Chairman. Aaron Abramovitz, am I pronouncing you right or wrong or close?
Got it.
All righty.
Well done. Hey, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
We
My name
might have
is-
should have started with you. If you'd
might
gotten
have.
here quicker and signed up, you maybe could have explained. what we're
Couldn't find the
dealing with.
sheet. My name is Aaron Abramovitz, as you've said. I'm CFO of Georgia Power Company. Hopefully these prepared remarks will answer some questions we've had. It will definitely highlight that this is a complex issue that has a bit of risk. I do appreciate the opportunity to be in front of y'all today. And as we've come to realize with the past hour, securitization is an extraordinarily complicated financial tool. And introducing it into the state of Georgia presents real complexities and risk. It should be utilized for specific, unplanned, and unforeseen instances, none of which exist today in this state. So first, what is securitization? I'll try to summarize from all the questions we got today. Securitization is a financing instrument used by states and utilities to recover large expenditures of an unexpected, unusual, and/or extraordinary nature. The utility recovers immediately 100% of expenditures securitized, and customers service the debt or bond over an extended period of time that includes cost and interest using low-cost debt relative to other financing options. Securitization does not eliminate a rate impact, as we've talked about today. It does reduce the impact and typically prolongs it, so it's over a longer period of time.
So you're getting paid up front. You go have a snowstorm, ice storm, have to spend $100 million fixing it. Instead of taking that out of your current income, you go borrow that money and repay it through this scheme over many, up to 30 years or however long.
So the utility, Georgia Power Company, in that kind of scenario, would get repaid upfront for those costs to remediate the storm.
And where does that money come from?
It comes from a bond,
Okay,
So
so a
it's-
loan,
a loan, but the loan is secured by the payment from the customers.
and no assets pledged. You're
No
not pledging a
assets.
coal ash plant or a nuclear
Correct.
generator.
It is pledged by the payment of the customer,
Okay.
by that non-bypassable
And
charge.
that's
on the
why it has
bill.
to be approved by PSC, because they're letting customers pay an upfront cost over up to 30 or 60 years in this deal.
That's right.
So it's a fiction as far as what's being securitized. It's only future rates, payments,
The security.
bills, power bills.
Yeah, I'll say it back to you. The security of the bond, the securitization is not an asset. It is the line on the bill, the non-bypassable charge that is irrevocable the second you put it on the bill until the bonds are paid off. So as you think through it, right, securitization obviously is going to lower the utilities cash flow, right? Because we get recovery of our assets over time as the balance sheet ebbs and flows as we invest in different assets across the spectrum of the state. And what this will end up doing is kind of what we're getting to here is it could limit future financial flexibility for not only Georgia Power, but its customers. As we mentioned before, securitization requires a non-bypassable charge that is set until the debt is paid off. The charge is irrevocable to the customer base, and that is what securitizes or secures the debt, not an asset. Bondholders receive protection through a non-impairment pledge, under which the state pledges that it will not take any actions that alter the charges or the law until the bonds have been repaid in full. Securitization binds future regulatory bodies and the state, removing future flexibility and optionality. Once the securitization bond is in place, it does not change. The Public Service Commission and state are bound by the decision. Securitization has been a tool in some states used almost exclusively to reduce the burden on customers for unforeseen costs that are beyond the control of the utility and the Public Service Commission. Examples in other states include hurricane or wildfire costs, stranded assets resulting from deregulation, and most recently in Texas and Oklahoma to fund the extremely high cost of fuel from last year's winter storm that caused immediate and extreme price spikes to the cost of electricity. Even as a utility option, securitization is a very complex tool. It can have unintended long-term consequences for both a state and its regulated utility and customers. These unintended consequences could include Georgia Power's credit profile could be impacted, resulting in higher interest and overall financing costs and higher bills for customers. Customers could bear the burden long-term of an asset, regardless of whether it is in operations. And as I mentioned before, securitization is irreversible, which removes the flexibility of future regulatory bodies to make future decisions in the best interests of customers. Georgians have long enjoyed reliable and affordable energy thanks to the constructive regulatory and legislative environment in our state, which has shaped the regulatory compact that we have here in Georgia. The regulatory compact provides assurances that regulators will not undo their prior decisions and not deviate from previous orders. The regulatory compact and the consistency and predictability that it brings is essential for regulated utilities to be able to access the capital for critical infrastructure projects, such as transmission, distribution, and transformers that are needed to keep the lights on for customers. Georgia's constructive legislative and regulatory environment, which is currently viewed as very solid by the financial community, is what supports Georgia Power's strong credit ratings and low cost of financing, which in turn leads to lower rates for our customers. Disruption to, or even doubt about the compact is likely to have negative consequences to our customers. For example, Georgia Power's cost of capital could go up and customer rates would rise as a result. As an example of the challenges of securitization, we can look at how applying the concept of Vogel 3 and 4 would be problematic. Back in 2017 and 2018, when the Public Service Commission approved moving forward with this project, it did so with an approved capital cost estimate of $7.3 billion, meaning that if the capital was spent prudently and the units were put in service for the benefit of customers, Georgia Power's investors would earn a fair return, the company's full cost of capital. That commitment was dependent on the capital being spent prudently and the asset actually serving customers. At this time, the PSC has made no determination regarding the costs above $7.3 billion. If the PSC determines that no costs above $7.3 billion were reasonable, for instance, customers would not have to pay for any of the costs above $7.3 billion. Securitizing cost overruns at the project, on the other hand, would obligate customers to pay those capital cost overruns. In summary, securitization is complex and risky. It should be utilized for specific, unplanned, and unforeseen instances, none of which exist today in the state. Georgia Power opposes Senate Bill 421 as written, even at Georgia Power's option. Caution should be considered, as even the notion or possibility of this financing instrument being explored as an option brings its own risk and burdens regardless of implementation. I'll answer a couple of other questions that came up. Somebody asked, how's Vogel 3 and 4 being financed? We have $5 billion in guaranteed debt from the federal government. That's the lowest cost debt you can get. The DOE, the federal government, has a securitized interest in the units. So we're already going after the lowest cost financing we can get for these units. It's already secured. We took our last draw with the DOE at the end of last year. So that's $5 billion of very inexpensive debt on the company's books, benefiting customers with low rates. Other than that, I would tell you that this is a pretty complicated venture, as we've talked about. Again, I'll say it again. And it's something that should be very purposefully done, because once you make the decision, once the charge goes on the bill, it doesn't come off.
Wouldn't that only be at your request, though, if it's optional to Georgia Power? Why are you afraid for us to give you the flexibility to decide whether it's wise or unwise? If you don't like it, just signal to the world, those idiots in the legislature gave us this option, but rest assured, bond market, we will never do this.
So it's
I don't get
the,
it.
I understand. And this word of option has come up a lot. And it would be the utilities option as the bill is written. That being said, the, if you will, the inclination that the state is entertaining this after projects have been serving customers for years.
State's allowing you to entertain it. They can't force it on you by this bill.
That's right. But the fact that it is actually being entertained and being provide it as an option where the commission, the PSC already has all the tools at its disposal to ensure that the company recovers costs in a prudent manner if they're deemed prudent or if they're spent prudently. It just seems like it's adding an overcomplication that's unnecessary at this point.
All right. What all states does the Southern Company operate in?
So electric utilities are in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia.
Do any of those, still, other than Georgia, does any of them allow this?
On a one-off circumstance was for Hurricane Katrina down in coastal Mississippi.
And did you utilize this securitizations?
Yes,
plan?
the entire state did.
Did y'all's bond rating go to the
It was put at
some
risk.
bad word? Was it hit?
It was it, yes.
Okay, so you probably wouldn't use this option again if it was given to you in Mississippi where you could if you wanted to.
Well,
Next hurricane comes through.
and the reason why it was used is because the devastation of that hurricane and the fact that we had to essentially rebuild the entire electric system from scratch. It was completely wiped out. That is an example of an unforeseen, unexpected circumstance. This bill doesn't contemplate that. This bill is very specific. It talks about 3 items. Doesn't talk about unforeseen, unexpected natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina.
If we pass this bill, would you like us to add those as an additional potential use? That's all that concern, right?
That'd be one of those concerns solved.
Other questions, Senator Kennedy? I think you had your light on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. I think that helps me understand some of this and all of us. So if I understand how you define securitization, that is, the loan is secured by the future payments of the customers.
Mhm.
So that's really very similar to an arrangement called factoring of receivables, right?
Sure.
So that's maybe a way for us to understand really how and what securitization is. It's a way for the company to factor the future revenue, the future receivables it will get from the customers specific to the securitization credit facility.
Yes, it's similar, but I want to be clear. Once somebody mentioned the use of a special purpose entity, it's no longer the company that gets those revenues. It's the special purpose entity that gets the payments from the bond. So the company's has its money. We got paid 100% up front, whatever the cost was. So I don't say we step away because we have to issue the bills, but that special purpose entity is what actually pays back the bond. So the company is almost removed from the process.
So what is provided as, okay, thank you. I think I got that. So if the customers pay the interest on securitized bonds, who's paying the debt?
So it's the interest and principals, not just the interest.
Okay, so the customers are paying the interest and
And
the
the-
indebtedness.
That's
So
correct.
traditional bond from that standpoint.
That's right.
Okay. So with securitization, it doesn't just shift the interest or the debt, it shifts both to the customer.
That's correct.
Okay. And then finally, could you speak to my question that I had for one of the witnesses earlier? If you have an opinion as to whether or not, if this legislation passes, could it have an impact on other debt structure rates, other debt facilities, whether they're probably not in existence, presumably those are locked in, but the company's ability to borrow non-securitized debt and other type facilities in the markets going forward?
So it raises the question, if you will, about that constructive environment that we have, that, wow, what was so imperfect or not working of what you had in the state that this had to be used? For assets that have served the customers, for those coal plants have served the customers for decades, Vogtle 3 and 4 for decades further, it's why did this have to be used? So it calls into question that constructive relationship. And that's the, if you will, the qualitative aspect of how bonds and debt are rated. It doesn't really have a lot to do with the actual quantitative metric of how I pay back my debt and how I cover that interest cost. But it would call into question qualitatively people's or the investment community's opinion of the constructive regulation around the state.
In other words, it puts another variable in the equation that injects some risk that's not quite in the model right now.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Does Georgia Power or Southern Company issue bonds outside of this scheme? I know you sell stock because I see you listed in the stock exchanges. Do you issue bonds to raise money?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we finance our balance sheet, if you will, our investments with a balance of equity, so stockholders, and debt. So we issue bonds on a routine basis.
And that doesn't require PSC approval.
They give us a financing authority. So they understand how we finance our business. They say, hey, your equity ratio, the amount of equity investment you put in your company is set. So you can work within these ranges. And then we also have a financing authority by FERC as well, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
Okay.
So it is regulated. We can't just go off and do things without approval or without eyesight or oversight by the Public Service Commission.
Those type of bonds are secured by the assets of the company.
They're secured by the balance sheet. With the exception of Vogel 3 and 4, there's not too many bonds or issues of a debt that we have out there. They're secured by physical assets anymore.
Okay. But by the goodwill and the future profitability of the company.
Right. And so that's why that bond rating in Georgia Power is so important, because it's how strong is the company at repaying that debt and repaying the interest on that debt.
But these type of bonds
Mhm.
would not be issued by the company at all. Wouldn't be pledging any of your assets. It's just future power bills will be dedicated to pay this
It's
at
future.
a lower interest rate than you guys can get out there wherever your borrowing sources
It
are.
would typically be at a lower interest rate. One example I'd give you is if our customer base, I'll just use a simple round number. Today, if we have 100 customers, those 100 customers are going to pay a non-bypassable charge for securitization. If for some reason our customer count goes down to 20, those 20 customers now have to pay the same non-bypassable charge, no matter what we're serving them with.
Well, good thing we've given y'all a monopoly on your customers. They can't leave you unless they leave the state. And boy, they're coming here in droves. Senator, again, this is probably the person to ask your question to a little while ago. Or do you need to be recognized?
A couple things. One of them, you said the PSC has allocated you like $7+ billion said to put towards the cost of Vogel. Said, and if they said, nope, you're not getting any more, that's all we're gonna do. Where's the rest of the money coming from that, because we don't ever know what exactly it's gonna finish out at, but if you spend $10 billion on it, said where's that gonna put you? Where's the other money coming from?
That would come from our shareholders
Okay.
and or our one equity investor, which is Southern Company, and their shareholders. And to date, we haven't requested any money or any rate recovery over $7.3 billion. And to date, while we have reserved the right to go back and ask through those prudence proceedings with the Public Service Commission for dollars over $7.3 billion, we've actually charged those dollars to our profits, to our earnings over the past 2 to 3 years. So our equity investors are already, quote, paying that charge for those cost overruns.
He heard it. I'll let him address it. So that's okay.
Yeah, let me wrap this up if I can. And good Lord, we got way off subject. We talked about is oil or natural gas the best thing to do? Is Georgia Power's cost overruns their fault or somebody? This bill has nothing to do with any of that. Number one, Moody's says this is credit positive when you do this. It does not hurt your credit. And Moody's is, the top expert on this. And we talked about, well, if you're borrowing more money, then you're going to have more debt, and then that puts you in a worse position. We're not talking about borrowing more money. We're talking about you got this debt and you can use this method to pay for it, or you can use another method to pay for it. It's the same debt. It's just a way to lower the interest rate. And it is totally at their permission to do this. If it's horrible, they would never ask for it. Again, the Public Service Commission will be in charge of regulating, is it prudent to do it? And I would say that, what we've seen have been some extreme cost overruns that were unanticipated in this bill. So again, credit positive according to Moody's, used in 22 states, totally at their permission, and it saves money. We're not talking about new debt. We're talking about, do you borrow it this way or do you borrow it this way? If you borrow it this way, you save money. If it's a 10-year bond, you look at 10 years. If it's a 60-year bond, which is Georgia Power has done this over a 60-year period is their plan. than you do a 60-year bond. Apples to apples, it saves money.
We have got, I'm counting empty chairs, 4 of our committee members that have had to leave to go to other meetings during your debate. A couple of those are your co-sponsors to this bill, which will presumably be in favor of your bill. I am a little uncomfortable voting until we can digest this a little bit. Let some of these parties continue to lobby the committee, and I'm a little bit concerned. Commissioner Pridemore was unable to be here today. She is actually on site at Plant Vogel.
I understood that, right?
I would kind of like to hear a little input from PSC, so since they are the regulatory body that will make these ultimate decisions. So if you're okay, I mean, if you're hot to trot for a vote today, you know, we'll
No,
consider, but
we
if
can
not,
hold
I'd
it.
like to put this on at our next meeting, allow very limited further input, particularly PSC, if they'd like to be heard, and then we'll see what we can do. I would recommend to all of the people that spoke today and the others of you out there that this has got your attention to share your thoughts and concerns with me and the other committee members before something of this significance, we take action on it. But we're getting to that point in the session where we can't continue to just hear things and not take action. We're going to have to. I apologize once again to the beer drinkers in the crowd. I guess we've gotten you almost up to happy hour now. You're going to have to wait again as well before we can take action on the 420. Several of us are late for a Judiciary Committee member meeting. I want to say, though, that we are set up for Thursday. Oh, see if I can find my sheet. Senator Gooch, your bill is down for a hearing, SB 529. Senator Brass, you've requested a hearing on Senate Bill 495. Those are going to be on the agenda Thursday. I am going to try to do a better job of timing. These are taking longer than I anticipated. But those will be the next 2 that we hear. Next week, we're going to meet Tuesday and Thursday. We will also have a meeting on committee day on Wednesday of next week, so we can work through some of the bills that are pending in this committee. We've got a couple other interesting things that members have asked for hearings on. Apologize for us running so late. Committee members, thank you so much for bearing with us. Senator Lucas, I didn't mean to cut you off. You always have valuable insights with your institutional knowledge, and we'll give you plenty of time to be heard on this issue before we take action. That the meeting's adjourned. Thank you very much.